Bernard Blackwell had not spoken a kind word to another living soul in 3 years, and he had come to prefer it that way. The land out past the Cimarron River in the Oklahoma Territory was hard and flat, and honest in a way that people never were. And when he had ridden his dun horse onto that stretch of grass in the spring of 1889, he had told himself with the quiet certainty of a man who has been burned down to the roots that this was where he would stay until the earth swallowed him whole. He was 31 years old, and he had the hands of a man twice that age, cracked along the knuckles and stained with the particular kind of permanence that comes not from dirt but from work that never ends. He had been a rancher in Texas, a drifter through Kansas, a man with a wife named Clara who had taken their daughter, and followed a railroad surveyor to St. Louis because Bernard had given her nothing worth staying for. He did not blame her. He had told himself that many times in the dark of his dugout, staring at the low earthen ceiling while the coyotes called to one another across the prairie. He did not blame her. But the not blaming had not made the hollow place inside him any smaller. He had come to the Oklahoma Territory for the land run of April 1889, though he had not ridden in the rush with the other Sooners and Boomers screaming across the starting line on their horses. He had waited. He had sat on his horse at the edge of the crowd and watched all those frantic human beings throw themselves at the future like it was something that could be caught, and he had felt nothing but a tired contempt. When the dust settled, and the tent cities rose and the surveyors drove their stakes and the speculators started haggling, he had walked his horse quietly to the land office in Guthrie, filed for a quarter section 12 miles southwest of town along a good creek called Redbird, and ridden out to it before the ink was dry on his claim papers. He had built a dugout first, the way sensible men did, cutting into a low rise on the south side of the creek where the bank gave him a natural wall. He packed the sod tight, laid cedar logs he dragged from the river bottom across the top, covered them with sod blocks, and moved in with his bedroll, his Winchester, his Dutch oven, and a tin box that held the only photograph of his daughter, Lily, who was now 8 years old and living in St. Louis with a woman who had once loved him. The photograph was the only soft thing he kept. Everything else was hard. His purpose was hard. His schedule was hard. He rose before light. He worked until dark. He ate beans and salt pork and whatever he could shoot. He slept without dreaming as much as he could manage. He planned to break the north field in the fall and plant winter wheat. He planned to eventually build a proper house, a small one room with a sleeping loft. He planned to live out his days without the complication of other people pressing their needs and their sorrows into his quiet life. The north field of his quarter section ran up to a surveyed line, and on the other side of that line was a claim that had been empty all through that first summer and into the fall. The stakes were there, and the corner markers, which meant someone had filed, but no one had come. Bernard had looked at the empty claim the way a man looks at a stray cloud, without particular interest or feeling. He assumed whoever had filed had given up, the way half the boomers gave up once they understood that free land was not free of the work required to keep it. He was wrong. Frances Maddox arrived on the second Wednesday of October in 1889, which was also the day the first real cold front came rolling down out of Kansas like a gray iron wall, pushing all the warmth out of the world ahead of it. Bernard was splitting wood behind his dugout when he heard the wagon, and he did not stop splitting wood. He heard it slow and then stop on the other side of the surveyed line, and he heard a woman's voice say something low and firm to the horse, and then he heard the creak of a wagon seat and boots hitting hard ground, and still he did not look up. He split another log. He set the halves aside. He set another log on the block. "Excuse me," the voice said, and it was closer now on his side of the line, and he looked up because there was no avoiding it. She was standing at the edge of his cleared ground, about 20 feet away, and she was looking at him with the dark, direct eyes of a woman who did not have time to be indirect. She was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that the wind had already pulled loose from its pins, wearing a traveling dress that had been green once and was now the color of something tired, and a wool coat that was a size too large for her and that he recognized as a man's coat. She was carrying a folded piece of paper in her left hand. She was not beautiful in any ornamental way. She was something better than that. She had a face built for weather and for thought, with a strong jaw and a wide mouth and those dark eyes that were currently assessing him with a frankness that he found, against his will, somewhat bracing. "Bernard Blackwell," she said. He put down the splitting maul. "Who's asking?" "Frances Maddox," she said. "I filed the claim on the quarter section to your north. I wanted to introduce myself before I started building because I expect we'll be neighbors and I prefer to know people's names rather than guess at them." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind pushed between them, cold and smelling of rain. "I know your section," he said. "I thought you'd given up on it." "Why would I give up on it?" she said, and there was no defensiveness in it, only genuine curiosity, the way you might ask why anyone would assume the sky was falling. "Most do," he said. He picked up the maul again. "I had things to settle in Missouri first," she said. "I'm here now." He split another log. He heard her not moving, which irritated him slightly because it meant she intended to continue the conversation, and conversations were a thing he had been doing quite well without. He set the split pieces aside and looked at her again. "The ground's already going hard," he said. "Too late to build much before winter." "I know that," she said. "I'm not a fool, Mr. Blackwell. I brought supplies to last through to spring. I'll live out of the wagon until I can get a proper shelter up." He stared at her. "In a wagon, through an Oklahoma winter." "I've seen worse accommodations," she said, and something in the way she said it told him that she was not boasting and she was not lying, and he found that he believed her completely. "Suit yourself," he said. She nodded once, folded the piece of paper back into her coat pocket, and turned and walked back to her wagon with the same purposeful stride she had arrived with. He watched her go, which was not something he had intended to do. He split 2 more logs before he stopped and looked at the sky, which had turned the particular shade of green-gray that meant the cold front was arriving faster than expected. He thought about a woman sleeping in a wagon through what that sky was promising. He picked up the maul and split 3 more logs. He did not sleep well that night. The next morning he woke to 6 inches of snow on the ground, and a temperature that had dropped so far so fast that his water barrel had a skin of ice across the top. He built his fire and boiled his coffee and ate the last of his cornbread, and then he stood in the doorway of his dugout and looked north across the white ground, toward the place where Frances Maddox's wagon sat, barely visible through the bare tree line along Redbird Creek, a thin curl of smoke rising from somewhere near it that told him she had managed a fire. He told himself that was good. He told himself that was her business and none of his. He told himself that a woman who showed up in October with a wagon full of supplies and a man's coat, and that particular set to her jaw, was not a woman who needed him to worry about her. He told himself all of this at some length while he put on his coat and his hat and walked across his north field through the snow toward that thin line of smoke. She had set up a cook fire in a ring of stones between the wagon and the bank of the creek, and she was crouched over it with an iron skillet, frying something that smelled like bacon, and she looked up at him as he came through the trees with the same direct assessment she had given him the day before, as if she had expected him and was simply confirming the expectation. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," she said. "Good morning," he said. He stood there with his hat in his hand, which he had not meant to take off and now could not put back on without seeming ridiculous. "That fire won't last long in this wind," he said. "You'll have a cold camp by noon." "I expect so," she said. "My dugout has a proper stove," he said. He said it the way a man states a geographical fact. He did not say it warmly. He said it as if he were reading from a surveying report. She looked at him steadily. "Are you inviting me to use it?" "I'm stating that it exists." The corner of her wide mouth moved, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "I appreciate the geographic information," she said. "I'll manage." He put his hat back on. "Right," he said. He stood there another moment. "The bacon'll burn," he said. She looked at the skillet and turned it. "Thank you," she said, and there was something in her voice that was warm without being sentimental, the warmth of a person who is genuinely grateful without needing to perform gratitude, and it went into him like a splinter, small and almost imperceptible and impossible to ignore once noticed. He walked back to his dugout. He spent the rest of the morning doing nothing of particular use. He sharpened his axe, which did not need sharpening. He re-oiled his Winchester, which he had oiled 4 days ago. He checked his supply of salt pork and beans and found them adequate to what he already knew they were adequate to. He was deeply irritated with himself. By midday the wind had shifted and was coming straight from the northwest, and he could no longer see the smoke from her fire. He sat by his stove and drank coffee and told himself it was her business. By 3 in the afternoon the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees and there were occasional hard pellets of ice mixed with the snow. He put on his coat. When he came through the trees he found her sitting in the wagon with the canvas pulled down, a blanket around her shoulders, eating what appeared to be cold bacon wrapped in a piece of bread. She looked out at him over the tailgate with those dark eyes and she said nothing at all, which he found infinitely more dignified than anything she could have said. "Come to the dugout," he said, "for the night. If this keeps up you'll freeze." She regarded him for a moment. "You're sure about that, Mr. Blackwell? You seemed fairly certain yesterday that you preferred your own company." "I never said I preferred it," he said, and the words surprised him somewhat as they came out because they were true. He had never said that. He had simply acted as though it were true. She climbed out of the wagon without another word of discussion, the blanket still around her shoulders, and she brought a flour sack with her that presumably held what she needed for overnight, and she walked beside him through the blowing ice back to his dugout. He held the plank door open for her, and she went in and stopped just inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness, and he watched her take in the low earthen room with its stove and its one table and its 2 crates that served as chairs and his bedroll on the platform in the corner and the tin box on the shelf beside the bed. "It's good solid work," she said, looking at the walls. "It keeps the weather out," he said. He went to the stove and put more wood in and found an additional tin cup for coffee. He could feel her in the room the way you can feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm, a difference in the quality of the air that your body registers before your mind does. He concentrated on the coffee. They sat on the crates on opposite sides of the table and drank coffee and ate the salt pork and beans he had made, and the wind screamed around the sod walls outside and the stove clicked and breathed heat into the low room and they talked. He had not meant to talk. He had meant to provide shelter and then sit in silence the way he had sat in silence for months. But Frances Maddox asked him about the stove and how he had gotten it out 12 miles from Guthrie, and he told her about the wagon and the mule. And that led to the mule that had died of a snakebite in August, which led to his horse the dun, which led to her asking about the creek and whether it ran reliable year-round, which led to a conversation about water and winter that turned into a conversation about farming that turned into a conversation about whether winter wheat was a reasonable plan for new broken ground. And they were 2 hours past dark before either of them noticed. He did not talk much in those 2 hours. She talked more than he did, but she also listened more than most people listen, with her head slightly tilted and her dark eyes attentive, like a person who takes information seriously and treats it carefully once they have it. She told him she was from Independence, Missouri, that she had been married at 22 to a man named Arthur Maddox who had died of typhoid 2 years later, leaving her the dubious inheritance of a boarding house that turned out to have more debts than rooms, that she had spent the next 4 years settling Arthur's accounts and running the boarding house down to its last useful piece of furniture, and that when she heard about the Oklahoma land run, she had spent 6 months planning and saving every cent she could find and had ridden to Guthrie and filed her claim with $22 and a wagon full of supplies and the absolute conviction that she was not going back to Missouri. "You filed in April," he said, April 22nd, she said. The day they opened the territory, I was in the line at the land office before dawn. But you didn't come until October. I had debts to finish settling, she said. A woman's word is her bond as much as a man's, whether the law thinks so or not. I didn't leave Missouri until every dollar I owed was paid. He looked at her across the table. The lamplight was amber, and the stove breathed warm, and outside the wind was doing its level best to pull the world apart. He thought about the kind of person who waits 6 months to come to their free land because they have debts to honor, who sleeps in a wagon in October in a wool coat too big for them, because they have planned for it, and they do not intend to be a burden, who walks through ice and blowing snow without complaint, because they have decided that complaining is a waste of the energy required to solve the problem. He thought about how long it had been since he had sat across a table from another human being and not wished they would leave. He was not wishing that. He gave her his bedroll and slept by the stove with his saddle blanket, and he woke before dawn and got the fire going and made coffee before she woke. And when she came off the sleeping platform with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her face still soft from sleep, she looked at him and said good morning in a voice that was still half in the night. And he said good morning and handed her the coffee, and it was the most natural thing he had done in 3 years. The storm lasted 2 more days. She stayed in his dugout, and they did not speak about it as a remarkable arrangement, because it was simply a practical one. The way 2 people caught in a blizzard in a farmhouse do not make speeches about the philosophy of hospitality. They simply build the fire larger and share what there is. She had brought her flour sack, which turned out to contain not just clothing and a hairbrush, but also a paper-wrapped packet of dried apples and a small amount of cornmeal. And she made cornbread on the second afternoon that was better than his had ever been, with a lightness to it that he did not understand since the ingredients seemed identical to the ones he used. "How do you get it to rise like that?" he said. "You have to believe it will," she said, and she was smiling when she said it, a real smile this time, warm and a little teasing, and it hit him somewhere in the chest with a force he was not prepared for. On the 3rd day the storm broke and the sun came out and turned the Oklahoma snow into a field of brilliant shattered light, and she put on her coat and her boots and walked out to check her wagon and her horse, and he walked with her because he wanted to. The horse was all right, sheltered under the cottonwoods, and the wagon was intact though buried up to the wheel hubs. She stood looking at her quarter section with the snow lying over it, flat and white and empty and huge, and he stood beside her and looked at it too. "It's a good piece of ground," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I chose it carefully." She paused. "It neighbors a man who seems to know what he's doing, which was one of the considerations." He looked at her sideways. "You looked into the neighboring claims before you filed." "I looked into everything before I filed," she said. A woman alone in new territory needs to know what she's choosing. The land office clerk told me the Blackwell claim was the best-kept quarter section in the county and that whoever held it had been there since spring without a single problem or complaint. She glanced at him with those dark eyes. "I filed on the basis of several factors: soil quality, water access, and sound neighborly proximity." He did not know what to say to that. He was fairly certain he had just been told, in the most matter-of-fact way imaginable, that she had chosen to live next to him on purpose. He felt the splinter go a little deeper. The winter of 1889 into 1890 was long and gray and occasionally brutal, and Bernard Blackwell discovered during it that he had a neighbor in the fullest sense of the word, meaning a person who existed in constant, meaningful proximity, and who changed the texture of his days simply by existing. He helped her build a proper dugout on her claim, not because she asked, but because she could not build the roof alone, and she worked alongside him the whole time, hauling sod blocks and packing them with the same efficient purposefulness she brought to everything. The dugout took them 4 days, and when it was done she stood in it and looked at the earthen walls and the cedar log roof and said, "That'll do," with a satisfaction that he found deeply pleasing to have been part of. They developed a pattern that winter, not an arranged one, not a spoken one, but the kind that grows between two people who occupy the same small world through a long cold season. She came to his dugout twice a week to use his larger stove for baking, and he ate whatever she made, and they talked over the table until the lamp burned low. He walked the fence of her claim with her when the weather allowed, learning the ground the way she was learning it, pointing out where the soil went sandy and where it was good black loam, and where the creek bent close enough to draw from. She listened and asked questions that were intelligent enough to make him think, which was a thing he had not done enough of in 3 years alone. He told her, in pieces and not all at once, about Clara and Lily. She received each piece quietly, without pity, which was what made him willing to offer the next piece. He told her about the ranch in Texas that had failed in the drought of 1886, about riding north with nothing but the dun horse and a bad temper, and the conviction that the fault was his own even if the drought had been God's. She told him about Arthur Maddox, not with grief, because the grief had had 4 years to work through her, but with the clear-eyed honesty of a woman who has looked at a thing long enough to understand it. Arthur had been a gentle man and a poor manager, she said. She had loved him, and she had spent twice the time of their marriage learning the shape of his mistakes. "You don't seem like a woman who makes his kind of mistakes," Bernard said one evening in January, when the wind was howling and the stove was working hard and she was sitting across from him with her dark hair pinned up in her hands around her coffee cup. "No," she said. "I learned from watching him." She paused. "I'm very careful about money. Too careful, maybe. Arthur used to say I was the most careful woman he'd ever met, and he didn't mean it as a compliment." "I mean it as one," Bernard said, and then he looked down at his coffee because he had said it before he had decided to say it, and the warmth in the room had shifted somehow. The air between them changed in the way that air changes when something true has been spoken in it. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, in the same warm way she had thanked him for the bacon warning, genuine and quiet and without performance. He went home that night in the January wind and lay in his bedroll, and stared at the low ceiling of his dugout and thought about how he had told himself he was done with people. He had said it to himself in several different ways over the past 3 years. He was done with the weight of being known by someone. He was done with the specific pain of disappointing people who depended on him. He was done with the particular loneliness of being lonely inside a life that looked, from outside, like it had everything required for contentment. He had said all of that. He had believed it with the thorough conviction of a man who has been truly hurt and is arranging his life so as to be never hurt again. He had said it. He had meant it. And somewhere between a woman walking up to him with a folded piece of paper in her hand and a piece of cornbread that rose the way good things rise when you believe they will, he had become not done. He did not know what to do with this. He was not a man who had ever been graceful about feelings. Clara had told him that more than once, in more than one tone. He processed emotions the way he processed difficult terrain on horseback, by going slowly and keeping his weight even and not making any sudden moves that might throw everything sideways. So he went slowly. He was her neighbor and her friend, and he was careful not to be more than that without knowing if more was something she wanted. Because Frances Maddox was a woman who had already arranged her life entirely on her own terms, and he was not going to assume that his feelings changed her terms one bit. February came and then March, and the ground began to soften, and Bernard broke the north field of his own claim, and then helped break the equivalent field on her claim. And she came behind the plow with a rake to break the clods, and they worked the land together in the first real warmth of that new spring, with the meadowlarks calling from the fence posts, and the sky the deep pure blue of the Oklahoma April. And he was aware with every pass of the plow of her moving behind him. Of the small sound she made, of the moment when she stopped and pushed her hair back from her forehead and looked across the turned black earth with an expression of such uncomplicated satisfaction that it made his chest ache. The nearest town of any size was Guthrie, 12 miles east, and Bernard went there once a month for supplies. He had always gone alone, hitched the dun to the wagon, made the trip in a day, spoken to as few people as possible, and come home before dark. In April of 1890, Frances asked if she could ride along because she needed seed and the bolt of calico and a new pair of boots since hers had given up the ghost somewhere between January and March, and he said yes without a moment's hesitation, which he noted with some internal amusement. Guthrie in the spring of 1890 was a city that had erupted from nothing in about a year and was enormously proud of itself. There were two-story wooden buildings going up everywhere, saloons and hardware stores and a newspaper office and a land office and a school that was only partially built and a church that had 4 walls and was working on a roof. The streets were a mud nightmare from the spring rains, and the whole place smelled of fresh lumber and horse and ambition. Frances moved through it with her list and her careful money and her direct manner, and people responded to her in the way that people generally respond to a woman who knows exactly what she wants and is not apologetic about wanting it. The men at the hardware store were helpful, the woman at the dry goods counter was friendly, and the bootmaker was so taken with her precise knowledge of what constituted a proper work boot that he threw in a pair of bootlacings for free. Bernard watched all of this from a comfortable slight distance, doing his own shopping, and he found that watching Frances Maddox navigate the world was one of the more entertaining things he had done in some time. He also found that she attracted notice, because she was a single woman running a solo claim in the territory, which was not unheard of but was not common, and some of that notice had opinions attached to it that he did not appreciate. The opinions were delivered by a man named Harlan Potts, who ran one of the saloons and who had apparently decided, in the way that some men decide things, that a woman alone on a land claim was a problem that needed solving, specifically by Harlan Potts. Bernard encountered him outside the dry goods store, where Potts had positioned himself to intercept Frances as she came out, speaking to her with the particular brand of smiling condescension that assumes a woman's refusal to be helped is itself evidence that she needs help. "I'm telling you, Miss Maddox," Potts was saying, with his thumbs in his vest pockets and his head at the angle of a man who considers himself quite reasonable, "a lady managing a quarter section alone is more work than any lady ought to have. Now I know a fella who'd make you a fair offer on that claim, Mr. Potts," Frances said, her voice carrying no particular heat. "I've told you twice now that the claim is not for sale. I'll tell you once more and then I'll stop telling you and simply stop listening." Bernard came up beside her. He did not say anything to Potts. He just stood there, which was something he had always been good at. He was not a small man, and he had the particular quality of stillness that comes from years of working alone in a landscape that demands your full attention, the quality of a man who is entirely present in a situation and entirely calm about it, which is often more alarming than aggression. Potts looked at Bernard and revised his approach. "No offense meant," he said, with a smile that was doing more work than smiles should have to do. "None registered," Frances said pleasantly, and walked to the wagon. They drove back to the claims in the afternoon sun with the supply wagon full and the meadowlark still busy on the fence posts, and somewhere about 5 miles from town, with the flat prairie spread gold and green around them and the Cimarron glinting in the far distance, Frances began to laugh. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprises the person having it, and she had to put her hand over her mouth and then gave up and just laughed, and he felt the sound of it hit him in the exact same place the cornbread smile had hit him, which was somewhere behind his sternum where he had believed for 3 years that nothing could reach any more. "Potts," she said when she had composed herself. "Potts," he agreed. "He was there in February, too," she said. "He came out to the claim. I told him the same thing and sent him off. I think he believes that repetition will eventually produce a different result." "Some men do," Bernard said. "You didn't say a word to him," she observed. "You were handling it." She looked at him sideways with those dark eyes, and the afternoon light was doing complicated things to her face, and she said, Yes, but thank you for standing there. He kept his eyes on the road. It's where I was. There was a pause and then she said more quietly, no, it wasn't. You came from the other side of the building. She looked back at the road ahead of her. Thank you, Bernard. He had told her to call him Bernard sometime in January, and she had, and hearing it from her had never once felt ordinary. He turned it over in his head now, the way she had said it, the way thank you meant more when Frances Maddox said it than when most people said almost anything. He concentrated on the road. That spring and into the summer of 1890, Bernard planted his winter wheat, and Frances planted corn and kitchen garden crops and a half-acre of sorghum. And they worked their separate claims through the long hot days, and came together in the evenings with the frequency and naturalness of people who have discovered that the end of a hard day is better when there is someone across the table from you. He ate at her place as often as she ate at his, and she was a better cook, which he told her plainly, and she told him he was welcome to the benefit of that fact as often as he liked, which made him feel a kind of warmth he did not know what to call. The summer brought its problems, as summer in the Oklahoma Territory always did. There were grasshoppers in July that got into her corn and required 3 days of brutal dawn-to-dusk work clearing them before they destroyed the whole stand, and he came and worked beside her both because she needed it, and because there was no alternative he was willing to consider. There was a fence dispute with a neighboring claim holder named Gaines who ran cattle, and whose animals kept getting through his south fence and onto Frances's claim. And Bernard rode over to Gaines' place and had a quiet conversation about fence maintenance that resolved the issue within the week. There was a moment in late July when Redbird Creek ran low and they were both worried about their wells, and they sat on his porch. He had built a proper house by then, a one-room frame house with a lean-to kitchen and a covered porch, and she had a sturdy soddy on her claim, and talked about water and contingency plans until it was too dark to see, and the stars had come out thick and close over the prairie. He had built the porch partly because it was a practical thing for hot evenings and partly, he understood now, because sitting on it with Frances in the warm dusk was one of the finest things available to him in his life, and he was not going to pretend otherwise, at least to himself. He was still moving slowly. He was aware of it. He was aware that she was aware of it because Frances was a woman who was aware of most things. She had not pushed. She had not hinted in any way he could call transparent. She simply continued being herself in close proximity to him, which was its own argument for everything he was afraid to articulate. What changed things was August, and a letter, and a man named Theodore Park. Theodore Park arrived at Frances's claim on a Thursday in August, riding a good horse and wearing a coat that was better than the weather required, and Frances came to Bernard's porch that evening with a look on her face that was carefully composed but that he had learned over 10 months to read past the composition of. "Someone I knew in Missouri came to see me," she said. He waited. "Theodore Park," she said. "He was a friend of Arthur's. He's been in Guthrie for 2 months. He came to ask if I'd consider marriage." The porch was very quiet. The crickets were going. A nighthawk was calling somewhere overhead. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "What did you tell him?" he said. His voice was level. He was proud of that. "I told him I needed to think on it," she said. He nodded. He looked at his hands on the porch rail. He thought about 3 years of telling himself he was done. He thought about a woman filing a claim next to his on purpose. He thought about January coffee and April cornfields and the sound of her laughing in a wagon 5 miles from Guthrie. He thought about how long a man can go on protecting himself before the protection becomes its own kind of damage. "Frances," he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I'm going to say something that I should have said before now," he said. "And I want you to understand that I am saying it because it is true and not because of Theodore Park, because it was true before Theodore Park arrived and will be true after he leaves, and I am not the kind of man who says things because of pressure. I am saying it now because I was being too careful, and that is its own kind of cowardice." She was looking at him with those dark eyes, and the lamp from the front window was casting a warm rectangle of light across the porch boards between them, and her hands were very still. "I don't want you to be alone," he said. "I don't want to be alone. I have been very carefully being alone for 3 years, and I have been wrong about it. You are the finest person I have known in a long time, Frances, and I am not a man who says that kind of thing easily, which you know by now. I would like to be considered as a possibility, if you're willing to consider it. Not because of Park, because of everything since October." She was quiet for so long that the nighthawk called twice more, and a horse moved somewhere in the darkness, and the lamp flickered inside and steadied. Then she said, "I have been waiting for you to say something like that for approximately 7 months. He stared at her. 7 months. "Since January," she said, and now she was smiling, the full warm smile that had hit him behind the sternum the first time he saw it, the one that was warm and a little teasing and entirely her. "I filed that claim next to yours for very specific reasons. Bernard Blackwell and soil quality and water access were not the first ones." The silence between them was no longer the silence of unspoken things, but the silence of two people who have said what needed saying, and are now in the astonished quiet on the other side of it. He got up from his chair and she got up from hers, and they stood very close together on the porch in the August dark, and he put his hand against her face carefully, the way he did most things, and she leaned into it with a naturalness that undid him entirely. "I need to speak to Park tomorrow," she said, clearly. "I don't leave things unclear if I can avoid it." "I know," he said. "I'll be here." "I know you will," she said. She rode over to Guthrie the next morning and spoke to Theodore Park, and when she came back in the late afternoon, she stopped her horse at his fence and looked at him across it and said, "It's done." And he opened the gate and she rode through, and that was that. They were married in November of 1890, in the Guthrie church that now had a proper roof, by a Methodist minister named Amos Ford, who had the pleasantly businesslike manner of a man who performs a great many frontier weddings, and has come to regard the institution with affectionate practicality. Frances wore her least tired dress, which was a deep blue wool, and Bernard wore his good shirt and the vest he had worn exactly twice before, and there were perhaps 15 people there. The minister, a woman from town named Harriet Cross, who had become Frances's friend over their supply trips, a couple of neighboring claim holders whose names Bernard knew from fence-line conversations, and a few others who came because a wedding in a new town is an occasion, and occasions are things people need in hard country. He held her hand through the ceremony and said the words the minister gave him to say, and watched Frances say her own words with the same steadiness she brought to everything she did, her dark eyes meeting his. And when the minister said they were married, she squeezed his hand once, firmly, the way she did everything, with intention. They combined the claims, not legally immediately, but practically, which mattered more. They talked it through at the kitchen table the week before the wedding, with the same methodical care they brought to farming decisions, which was part of why it went well. His quarter section and her quarter section together made a half section of 320 acres, which was more land than two people could work alone, but was entirely reasonable for two people working together. His claim had better wheat ground on the north. Her claim had better water access from the creek bend and better soil for corn. They made a plan. The practical combining of the claims required a great deal of physical work, and they did it together through that November and December while the year turned cold again, and they were, this time, inside the same house. He had moved his things to Ersati because it was larger and better situated, and they spent the winter evenings making it more livable. A second room added, a proper floor of packed clay, and then boards when the lumber came from Guthrie, curtains that Frances made from the calico she had been buying all year, a bookshelf that he built from cedar planks, and on which sat her 3 books and his Bible and the tin box with Lily's photograph. He had written to Clara in the fall before the wedding, a letter that was as honest as he knew how to make it. He told her he was remarrying. He told her the woman's name. He asked about Lily with the diffidence of a man who has forfeited his right to ask but who cannot stop asking. Clara wrote back in December, a letter that arrived just before Christmas, and she said that Lily was well and in school and had grown and that she was glad he had found someone, and she wrote it without bitterness, which he was grateful for. She enclosed a small drawing Lily had made of what appeared to be a horse, though it might have been a dog. He put it in the tin box beside the photograph. The winter of 1890 into 1891 was their first winter together, and it was different from the winter before in every way that matters. The house was warm and there were 2 people in it, and they talked in the evenings by the lamp, and she read to him, sometimes from her books, and he fixed things, and made improvements in the small, constant way that a man makes improvements on a place he intends to stay in forever, which was the first time that phrase had been true for him since before the Texas drought. He intended to stay forever. He intended it with every fence post he drove and every roof board he laid, and every morning he woke up with the sound of her moving in the kitchen and the smell of coffee. He had been done with people. He had been done with land. He had said so to himself with great conviction. He had been wrong, spectacularly and gratefully wrong, in the way you can only be wrong when the thing that proves you wrong is better than you knew to hope for. Spring of 1891 came in hard and bright and full of purpose, and they planted together, a larger operation now with both claims ground to work. Bernard bought a second mule from a farmer named Cresswell who was giving up and going back to Illinois, which made the plowing go twice as fast, and Frances organized the seed and the kitchen garden with the efficiency of a general and the patience of a gardener, which are not always the same things but are best when they coexist. She planted a row of roses along the south wall of the house, which he told her were not practical, and she told him that nothing worth having ever was purely, and the roses came up that summer and bloomed in July in a riot of pink that he stood and looked at with more feeling than he expected. By midsummer of 1891, he knew she was expecting a child, because she told him at breakfast one morning in June with the same directness she brought to everything, setting down her coffee cup and looking at him across the table and saying, "I believe we are going to have a child in January." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he got up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands, which were warm from the coffee cup, and he did not say anything at first because there was a great deal to feel and he felt all of it in order, something that moved through him like weather, like that first cold front moving south out of Kansas, except the opposite of cold, the opposite of gray. "January," he said. "Or February," she said. "It's not a precise science." "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm very well," she said, and she was smiling and her hand squeezed his. He wrote to Lily that summer. Not through Clara but directly to Lily herself, a letter addressed in his best handwriting to Miss Lily Blackwell in care of Mrs. Clara Whitmore, which was Clara's married name now. He told Lily that he was married to a fine woman named Frances and that they were expecting a baby, and that if she ever wanted to come visit the Oklahoma Territory, the door was open. He was not sure if Clara would give Lily the letter. He sent it anyway. The summer of 1891 was busy and good. The wheat came in well enough to sell some in Guthrie, the first real profit he had seen from the land, and Frances sold her corn at a price. She negotiated with the grain buyer in a conversation that Bernard listened to with profound admiration, because she came away with 3 cents a bushel more than the man had opened with. She was good with money and good with people and good with land, which were the 3 things that mattered in the Oklahoma Territory in 1891, and she was also good with him, which was the thing that mattered most. They had their disagreements, because 2 strong-willed people on 320 acres of hard country with limited resources will disagree about things, but their disagreements had a particular quality that he had not experienced before, which was that they were honest and they resolved. They argued about the second mule's pasture in August and about whether to sell the winter wheat crop or hold it waiting for a better price in September. And in both cases, they argued the way two people argue when they are each taking the thing seriously rather than taking their own position seriously, which is to say they listened as much as they talked, and they came to conclusions that were not exactly either person's starting point, and that worked. He had never been good at that kind of arguing before. He had been good at the other kind, the kind where you dig in and the other person digs in, and you end up on opposite sides of a wall with neither of you sure how the wall got so tall. He was learning a different thing with Frances, and the learning of it, the daily practice of it, was one of the quiet pleasures of his life. The baby came in February of 1892, not January as she had predicted, in a hard cold week when the snow was deep and Bernard had ridden 12 miles in the dark to fetch the midwife, a woman named Bessie Drummond who was round and calm and experienced, and who spoke to Frances in a low, steady voice throughout the whole of that long night while Bernard sat by the kitchen stove and worked through the hours by feel alone, which was the hardest night of his life in a way that had nothing to do with difficulty and everything to do with love. They named him James Arthur Blackwell, the Arthur for Frances's first husband, which was a generosity that moved Bernard in ways he could not articulate and did not try to. James was born at 5 in the morning with the snow still falling and the lamp burning and Bessie Drummond handing him to Frances with a competent matter-of-fact tenderness. And when Bernard came to the doorway of the room and Frances looked up at him holding their son, the hollow place inside him that he had been carrying for 3 years closed in a way that he had not believed was possible, and that he found, standing there in the lamplight, he had been wrong to disbelieve. James was small and dark-haired and extremely loud about his opinions, which Frances said was both appropriate and inevitable given his parentage, and Bernard could not argue with that. They sent Lily a letter with the news. In March, they received a letter back, addressed in a child's handwriting to Mr. Bernard Blackwell, which meant Clara had given her the earlier letter after all. Lily wrote 3 sentences in large, careful letters. "Dear Father, I am glad you have a baby. I draw horses now. Maybe I can visit someday, your daughter Lily." He read it 3 times and then read it aloud to Frances, and she said, "She can visit whenever she likes. Write back and tell her." He did. The spring of 1892 brought the work that a farm with an infant brings, which is all the usual work plus the constant creative problem-solving of 2 people who cannot both be in the field at once when one of them is needed in the house. They managed it because they were practical, and because James turned out to be the kind of baby who could be settled in a wooden box, padded with blankets and left in the shade near the field, while both of them worked nearby, watching him in turns, which was not something Bessie Drummond would have officially approved of, but which James appeared to find acceptable. He slept a great deal in the open air, and when he was not sleeping he watched the clouds and the birds with an expression of solemn consideration that Bernard found enormously amusing and Frances found entirely appropriate. "He's thinking," she said one afternoon, looking over at the box where James was considering a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. "About what?" Bernard said, leaning on the plow handle. "Land, probably," Frances said. "He's a Blackwell." Bernard stood there in the April field with the black earth turned up around him, and the hawk circling, and his son watching it and his wife smiling at him with those dark eyes, and he had to look away for a moment at the flat horizon, because the feeling was too large for the middle of a workday. The summer of 1892 was the driest in 3 years, and they watched the sky daily with the particular anxiety of farmers, which is a constant negotiation between hope and reality. The corn suffered. The wheat had been cut in June before the worst of the dry hit, so they were all right on that. But the kitchen garden was a daily battle, and the creek ran lower than it had before, and Bernard spent 2 weeks in July digging the well deeper, which was heavy, miserable work in the heat. Frances brought him water and cold biscuits at the rim of the well and sat and talked to him while he worked, not because she had nothing else to do, but because she knew, without being told, that the work went better with company, which was something he had once been wrong about and now understood was simply true. Harlan Potts appeared once more, in late August of 1892, not at the claim, but at the grain buyer's office in Guthrie, where Bernard had gone to settle the wheat payment. Potts had expanded his interest from saloons to land speculation, and was apparently buying up claims from discouraged settlers at low prices and reselling them, and he had opinions about the Blackwell operation that he delivered in the grain buyer's outer office while Bernard was waiting. He said, loudly enough to be clearly intended for Bernard's ears, that the smart move for anyone sitting on a half-section of marginal ground in a dry year was to sell off the second quarter before it became a liability. Bernard finished waiting for the grain buyer, received his payment, folded it carefully into his pocket, and turned to Potts on his way out the door. He said, "The second quarter belongs to my wife. She'll be very interested to hear your assessment of her land. I'll tell her exactly what you said." He paused. "She'll likely come in to discuss it with you herself." Potts looked at him and then looked away. "No offense meant," he said, for the second time, with the same smile working harder than it should have to. "None registered," Bernard said, which was Frances's line and which he had always thought was exactly the right thing to say, and he walked out. He told her that evening on the porch, sitting in the warm August dark with James asleep inside, and she laughed the same surprised, delighted laugh she had laughed in the wagon on the way home from Guthrie in April of 1890, and he sat beside her and felt the whole weight of everything settle quietly and perfectly around him. Lily came to visit in the September of 1892. She was 11 years old and had her mother's fair hair and her father's gray eyes, and a serious, watchful quality that dissolved, by the second day, into a child's natural enthusiasm for a farm with a baby and animals and open space. She had taken the train from St. Louis to Guthrie with a neighbor woman who had family in the territory, the arrangement having been negotiated in careful letters between Bernard and Clara over the spring and summer. Frances met the train with Bernard, and Lily stepped down from the car and looked at her father with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed, and that fell apart completely when he went down on one knee on the platform and opened his arms. He held his daughter for a long time. She smelled like the train and like a child and like soap. He did not say anything. She said into his shoulder, "I have 8 drawings of horses. I brought them." "I want to see all of them," he said. Frances gave them space, which was one of the many things she was good at, knowing when to give space and when to fill it. She stayed back on the platform until Lily looked over Bernard's shoulder and regarded her with the careful assessment of a child who has learned to read adults. Frances smiled at her, not with the big warm smile but with the smaller honest one, the one that was less performance and more just herself. "You must be Frances," Lily said. "I am," Frances said, "and you must be Lily. I've heard a great deal about you." "From my father," Lily said with the directness of an 11-year-old. "From your father," Frances confirmed. "He says you draw horses." Lily looked at her father, who was standing now and looking back at her. "He told her," she said, with the tone of someone confirming an important data point. "I tell Frances most things," Bernard said. Lily considered this and then nodded in a way that meant she had decided this was acceptable. By the time they reached the wagon, she was telling Frances about the horses, and by the time they were 5 miles out of Guthrie, she had produced the drawings from her bag and was explaining each one in detail. And Frances listened with exactly the same quality of attention she gave to Bernard, careful and genuine and interested. And Lily, who was a perceptive child, noticed and softened all the rest of the way. She stayed 3 weeks. She held James with the grave, careful competence of a girl who has been around infants, and she helped in the kitchen garden with Frances, and she followed Bernard around the farm asking questions about everything, the mules and the wheat and the fence and the creek and the well, and he answered every question, and found that he had more to say than he had expected, because answering questions from someone who genuinely wants to know is entirely different from talking at someone. She slept in the loft and helped with breakfast and showed Frances her horse drawings, all 8 of them, which Frances studied with the same seriousness she brought to land surveys, and which she declared to be very fine work. Lily told her she wanted to be a painter, and Frances said that was an excellent thing to want, and that a person should always know what they want and pursue it, and Lily looked at her with something that was the beginning of admiration. When she left at the end of September, she hugged her father for a long time on the Guthrie platform, and then she turned and hugged Frances too, which was not a thing anyone had planned for or expected, and Frances hugged her back firmly and said, "Come back next summer," and Lily said, "I will," and got on the train. Bernard watched the train go for a long time. Frances stood beside him and did not say anything, and after a while he put his hand on her shoulder and she leaned against him slightly, and that was all that needed to happen. They went home. The years moved the way years do in the Oklahoma Territory, in the rhythm of planting and harvest and the particular seasons of hard country. A late frost in April of 1893 that took most of the fruit trees but left the crops. A good wheat year in 1893 that let them put real money aside. James growing into a sturdy, walking, talking person with definite opinions by the time he was 2. And by 3, he was following Bernard around the farm saying why to everything the way children do. And Bernard, who had thought of himself as a man with little patience for conversation, found that he had an infinite reservoir of explanation available for James's particular variety of question. Frances planted the south pasture with additional garden crops in 1893 and sold produce at the Guthrie market on Saturdays through the summer, which brought in steady money and also brought her into the social life of the territory in a way that she managed with the same careful practicality she managed everything. She knew everyone's name and their children's names, and she had a network of information about the territory that Bernard found deeply useful and somewhat astounding. The way she could tell him in October what price the grain buyer was likely to open within November based on 3 conversations she had at the Saturday market. In the summer of 1894, Frances told him at breakfast that she believed they were expecting another child, and he got up and came around the table exactly as he had in June of 1891 and crouched beside her chair and held her hands, and she said, "I see you're developing a tradition," and he said, "I am," and she laughed. The second child was a daughter, born in January of 1895 in a cold snap that was nowhere near as frightening as James's February blizzard, with Bessie Drummond presiding again, calm and round and competent as ever. They named her Ruth, and she came into the world in the early afternoon with a quietness entirely unlike James, looking around the room with an expression of calm assessment that Frances said was pure Blackwell and Bernard said was pure Maddox, and they agreed to call it a draw. James was 3.5 and received the news of a sister with the measured acceptance of a child who has been raised by 2 people who deal honestly with whatever arrives. He looked at Ruth in Frances's arms and said she was small and went back to his blocks, which was fair. Lily wrote every month now. Her letters had grown from the careful 3-sentence productions of an 11-year-old into real letters, full of observations and questions, and the developing voice of a girl who was becoming a young woman. She drew horses and now people too, and she sent occasional sketches tucked into the letters. Bernard wrote back every time. Frances added notes at the bottom of his letters and eventually began writing her own letters to Lily alongside his, and Lily wrote to Frances separately, and the correspondence had become its own established thing. Lily came to visit in the summers of 1893 and 1894 and 1895, each time staying a month, each time integrating further into the life of the farm, with the naturalness of a person who belongs to a place, even if she did not start there. In 1895, she met Ruth as a 6-month-old and held her with the same grave care she had given James. And Ruth looked up at Lily with the calm assessment she brought to everything, and then made a fist in Lily's hair, which Lily declared to be affection and Bernard declared to be typical. The farm grew. Not in acreage, but in everything else. The tools, the stock, a third mule acquired in 1894 from a satisfied transaction with Cresswell's neighbor, a small smokehouse Bernard built that winter for the pork, a root cellar that Frances directed the construction of with such precise instructions that it came out perfectly on the first try. They were not wealthy, but they were genuinely solvent, which in the Oklahoma Territory in the 1890s was a kind of wealth, and they were building something that had the particular solidity of a thing built right. He thought about this often, in the early mornings before the house woke up, standing on the porch with his coffee in the dark, and looking at the shapes of the farm emerging from the night as the sky went from black to gray to the first pale gold of another Oklahoma dawn. He thought about who he had been when he rode up to that surveyed line in the spring of 1889, and about the man he was now, and about the extraordinary, unlikely chain of events that had produced the difference. A woman had filed a claim next to his. He had walked through the snow to check on her fire. She had made cornbread that rose the way good things rise when you believe they will. He had said he was done. He had said it with conviction and with some justification. He had been wrong in the best possible way, and being wrong had given him back his daughter and given him a son and a daughter of his own, and given him a woman across the table who was the finest person he had known, and given him this farm and this porch and this sky and this morning. He was not done. He had discovered, at 31, and then 32, and then 33, that a man can be wrong about himself in ways that are the greatest gift available, if the right thing comes along to show him the error. Frances came to the porch door in the early light, wrapped in a quilt, her dark hair loose around her shoulders the way it only was in the mornings, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that were still, after 5 years, the most direct and honest eyes he had ever looked into, and she said, "Coffee's on." "I know," he said. "I made it." "You're on the porch again," she said. "I like the porch," he said. She came out and stood beside him with her quilt and looked at the same thing he was looking at, which was the farm waking up in the golden light, the shapes of the fields and the fence line and the cottonwoods along the creek and the mules moving in the pasture, and she was quiet beside him in the comfortable way of two people who have no need to fill each other's silences because the silences are part of the conversation. "I was thinking," he said. About being wrong," he said. He looked at her sideways. "I was wrong about most of the important things when you showed up." She looked back at the farm. The corner of her wide mouth moved. "I know," she said. "I counted on it." He laughed, which was a sound that had come back to him gradually over the past 5 years like a creek filling after a dry year, and it was easy now, easy and frequent and real. She smiled at the laugh, her full warm smile, and he put his arm around her quill-trapped shoulders and she leaned against him, and the sun came up over the flat Oklahoma horizon and turned the whole world gold. The letter from Clara arrived that October, a careful, polite letter with an item of news inside it that made his hands go still. Clara was remarrying and moving to Denver. She wanted to discuss Lily's situation. Lily was 14 now, old enough to have some say, and she had been very clear in her opinion, which was that she wanted to spend the school year in Denver with Clara and her summers in Oklahoma with her father and Frances and James and Ruth. Clara thought this was reasonable if Bernard and Frances agreed. Lily had written her own letter on the subject, enclosed with Clara's, direct and earnest and unmistakably her. "Dear Father and Frances, I know this is a big thing to ask, but the farm is where I feel like myself. I hope you will say yes, please say yes. Love, Lily." He read both letters to Frances at the kitchen table that evening, and Frances listened with her coffee cup in both hands and then said, "Well, obviously yes." She paused. "Right back tonight. She shouldn't wait." He wrote that night, and Lily's answering letter came back 3 weeks later, addressed to both Bernard and Frances Blackwell, and it said in the first line, "I am so happy I cried." He put that letter in the tin box with the photograph and the horse drawings. The following June, Lily came for what was now understood to be her summer, and she arrived at the Guthrie station with a sketchbook under her arm, and a hat with a blue ribbon, and a height that startled him, because she was taller than she had been at Christmas, and he had not quite adjusted to the ongoing fact of a daughter who kept growing. She was 14, and she was becoming a person of considerable depth, observant and thoughtful and funny in the dry, quiet way that he recognized as a version of himself. And Frances received her at the station with a hug and a comment on the hat that made Lily immediately explain the blue ribbon's precise significance. And they were talking by the time they reached the wagon, and did not stop the whole way home. That summer James was 4 and Ruth was 6 months past her first birthday, and the farm was in full summer operation. And Lily fell into it the way she had always fallen into it, picking up the rhythms of the place and the people with the ease of someone returning rather than arriving. She drew constantly. She drew James's solemn face and Ruth's curious one, and the mules and the fields and Frances hanging washing on the line and Bernard at the well. And she gave Bernard a drawing at the end of that summer before she went back to Denver, which was a pencil drawing of the farmhouse from the south side with the rose bushes in bloom along the wall and 2 figures on the porch, small and exact and clearly themselves. He had it framed by the Guthrie carpenter that fall and hung it on the wall beside the kitchen doorway where it could be seen from the table. The years continued in their good rhythm. By 1897, Bernard and Frances Blackwell had the most reliably productive half-section in their county, with crops that came in consistent enough to have built up real savings, a well that never failed, a smokehouse that kept them in pork and venison, and a farm that looked the way a farm looks when it is loved, which is to say tended to with continuous care rather than crisis management. James at 6 was serious and curious, and followed Bernard everywhere with questions that required real answers. And Bernard gave real answers, the way he had once answered Lily's questions, which meant that James by 7 knew more about soil and water and animal husbandry and fence maintenance than most grown men who had not spent their lives farming. And he received this knowledge with the gravity of a person who understands that useful information is a serious gift. Ruth was quieter than James and noticed more, with the calm assessment she had arrived with still intact, observing the world from behind it with what Frances called her counting eyes, because she seemed to be cataloging everything she saw. She was fascinated by the kitchen garden and by Frances's method of organizing the seed packets, and by 3, she was sitting beside Frances at the table and being shown, seriously and carefully, how to sort and label seeds, and she handled this with a reverence that Bernard found both amusing and deeply satisfying. Lily at 17 was in Denver for her school year, excelling in her art and in mathematics, which surprised everyone except Frances, who said she had seen it coming from the directness of the girl's eye. She wrote twice monthly and came in the summers, and was by now a genuine and established member of the household, helping with the farm, sitting with Frances in the evenings, teaching James and Ruth to draw horses with enough success that the kitchen table was frequently covered in paper, and the careful sound of children's pencils. In the summer of 1898, Lily came for her summer and brought news. A woman in Denver who taught painting had looked at her sketchbook and told her she had real ability and should consider formal study. There was a school in Chicago. It cost money that was not available. She told them this over dinner one evening in a careful voice that was trying not to want anything. Bernard and Frances looked at each other across the table in the way they had developed over 8 years of marriage, a whole conversation in a single exchange of eyes. He raised an eyebrow. She nodded once. "How much is the school?" he said. Lily told him. "We have that," Frances said in her matter-of-fact way. Not easily, but we have it. We've been saving for something that mattered. She looked at Lily. This matters. Lily looked between them with an expression that was struggling hard to stay composed and losing the struggle. It's too much, she said. I can't, Lily, Bernard said. She stopped. He looked at her. You are my daughter, he said. I was not there for a great many of the years when I should have been. I am telling you now that this is not a burden. This is the least complicated thing I have done in a long time, and I want to do it without argument. Do you understand me? She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. Good, Frances said. Write to the school in the morning and tell them you're coming. Lily went to Chicago in the fall of 1898 and wrote long, extraordinary letters full of paint and light, and the descriptions of a young woman discovering what she is made for. Her drawings came back changed, more assured and more complex, and they put them in the frames he had made and hung them on the farmhouse walls, until the walls of the kitchen and the sitting room had become a gallery of everything Lily had seen and rendered over the years. The farm, the horses, the mules, James's face, Ruth's face, Frances at the well, Bernard on the porch, the roses, the flat horizon of the Oklahoma Territory at dawn. The house felt full and lived in and real, the way a house feels when it has been made by and for a specific set of people over a long time, each room holding the evidence of its occupants in the kind of accumulated specific detail that cannot be arranged, only accrued. On a September evening in 1899, 10 years after Frances had walked up to him with a folded piece of paper in her hand and introduced herself as his neighbor, Bernard sat on the porch in the last warmth of that year's summer, with the cooling evening coming in off the prairie and his coffee growing cold in his hand, and he was looking at the farm. James was 8 and was somewhere in the barn, which was audible because James at 8 was never entirely quiet. Ruth was 6 and was in the house with Frances, doing something involving the kitchen and a great deal of flour by the sound of it. Lily's letter from the previous week was in his shirt pocket because he had read it twice and intended to read it again. The roses on the south wall had finished for the year and were rust-colored and done, and the cottonwoods along the creek were going yellow, and the mules were still in the far pasture, and the sky was the particular October-edge blue that comes only in the last days of September when the summer is finished, but the fall has not yet fully committed. Frances came out onto the porch with a dish towel over her shoulder and a flower handprint on her apron and a cup of coffee, and stood beside him looking at the same sky. And he looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and she had the first gray at her temples that had appeared in the past year, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes that had deepened with the seasons, and she was more herself than she had ever been, which meant she was more beautiful than she had ever been. In the way that real things become more themselves over time rather than less. James is in the barn, she said. I know, he said. I can hear him. He's explaining something to the mules, she said. They probably need it, he said. She sat down beside him on the bench he had built into the porch rail and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they sat like that while the sky went from blue to violet to the first hints of rose where the sun was going down in the west. And James's voice drifted from the barn, explaining, and Ruth's voice drifted from inside the kitchen, asking Frances a question Frances could not answer from the porch, which made Ruth come to the door and ask it again. What is it? Frances said. How much salt? Ruth said, holding a spoon. Pinch, Frances said. How big a pinch? Ruth, Frances said, with the patience of a woman who has answered this exact question before. Use your judgment. You have good judgment. Use it. Ruth considered this and went back inside, and Bernard heard the quiet sound of Ruth deciding, which was recognizable because Ruth made decisions the same way Frances made decisions, thoroughly and without drama. He held Frances against his side while the evening came down soft and good around them. The farm breathed. The creek said whatever creeks say in the evening. The mules moved once in the pasture and settled. James came out of the barn finally, saw his parents on the porch, and came up the steps and leaned against the rail and looked at the same sky they were looking at, because he had grown up looking at this sky with these two people, and it was simply where you looked at the end of the day. "What were you telling the mules?" Bernard asked. "About winter," James said. "I was explaining about winter coming." "Did they understand you?" "The gray one did," James said. "The brown one was looking the other way." Frances made a sound that was almost entirely composed of love, and James looked at her with the faint suspicion that he was being quietly laughed at, which he was, warmly and without malice, and which he eventually decided was acceptable because it was his mother doing it, and she did it to his father too, and his father never seemed to mind. Bernard did not mind. He had, at 31, said that he was done with people, and done with land, and done with the particular heartbreak of trying and failing at the full human enterprise of belonging to someone and somewhere. He had come to this flat piece of Oklahoma territory with his dun horse, and his Dutch oven and the hollow place where hope used to be, and he had planned very carefully to finish his days in the clean, functional solitude of a man who has given himself permission to stop wanting. And then Frances Maddox had filed a claim right next to his. And he had been, spectacularly, inexhaustibly, gratefully, not done. He was not done with the land, which produced and struggled and surprised him every year, and which he would tend until he could not stand. He was not done with people, which turned out to include a daughter who drew horses and a son who explained winter to mules, and a daughter with counting eyes who used her judgment with a pinch of salt, and a woman beside him on a porch in September with flour on her apron and gray at her temples, and those dark, direct eyes that had assessed him frankly in October of 1889, and found him, apparently, worth the claim next door. He was not done. He looked at the sky going rose and gold over his farm, and he was certain of this with the absolute groundedness of a man who has learned the difference between protecting himself and living, which is the most important education available, and which had been delivered to him by a woman who planned everything carefully and who had considered, when filing her land claim in the Oklahoma Territory in the spring of 1889, the quality of the neighboring claim holder as one of her primary factors. He turned his head and pressed his lips briefly to the top of her dark hair, which smelled like flour and like the particular warmth of her, and she squeezed the hand she was holding once, firmly, with intention. "Supper'll be ready soon," she said. "I know," he said. They sat a little longer on the porch while the last light went from the sky and the first stars came out over the territory, sharp and close in the clear fall air, and James was beside him and Ruth was inside deciding about salt, and Lily's letter was in his pocket, and the roses were rust-colored and done for the season, and the creek ran in the dark toward the Cimarron, and the farm was solid and present, and his, theirs, and there was not a hollow place left in him worth measuring. He was not done. He had never been less done.